Public health is political. Public health has always been political. It will always be political. And every time that public health practitioners declare their practice to be apolitical, they lose the political argument. And so we begin with the idea that the limitations of our pandemic response are not a failure of public health science, but a failure of public health policy to recognize the importance of the collective lens of public health. The Trump administration, if we can remember, largely neglected the pandemic response during its early and crucial responses, denying public health science, stoking discriminatory rights violations, and undermining global governance when collective action was needed most across the world. And yet, despite a hopeful new beginning under the Biden administration, pandemic control policy has continued to undermine, we argue, the moral foundations of public health. And so good morning, everyone, from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Grateful for Carol's warm introduction. I'm Benjamin Meier, and it's my honor to moderate this conversation on the political determinants and ethical implications of the American pandemic response, joined by my inspiring co-authors from across fields and disciplines who have come together to defend what we see as an undermining of public health principles in the midst of a public health emergency. The five of us came together just 1 year ago on May 13, 2021, when CDC Director Rochelle Walensky went before the American people and in scripted remarks warned the public that, quote, "your health is in your hands," undermining the idea that fighting COVID-19 is a public health responsibility that requires public support from public institutions. We found that this individual blame in saying your health is in your hands, individual blame from the nation's highest public health official, challenged the very meaning of what it is to talk about the public's health. And so we wrote in the Lancet Discovery Science to call for returning to the foundational principles of public health, focusing on issues of collective responsibility, health equity, and human rights. And I hope that someone can drop in the link to that initial article in the chat. We argued that public health implicates government responsibility, government obligations to realize the health of populations. And we sought to defend the foundational idea that public health actions protect and promote the health of entire populations through multi-sectoral interventions that address underlying determinants of health. And yet we worried that US public health efforts in the pandemic response were centering individual responsibility rather than collective responsibility. Individual responsibility for personal benefit, your health is in your hands, rather than collective responsibility for public benefit. We argued that this was a moral failure that revealed the moral foundations of public health and that raised an imperative to openly discuss ethics and politics in public health policy. This is a moral failure. Since we wrote that article, 400,000 more would die in the United States in the ensuing year, with millions more suffering needlessly from this disease. And yet little has changed in our policies over that year, as we convinced ourselves day in and day out that the variants were mild, that the dead were responsible for their own suffering, that the pandemic was over. Wave after wave, hundreds of thousands suffering, unacknowledged mourning, and no government responsibility to take public action for public benefit. In labeling this continuing threat a, quote, pandemic of the unvaccinated, we found this daily failure to represent a moral failing of US policy, undermining the fundamental notion that all people are equal in dignity and rights, and implicitly shifting blame to individuals for what are in fact systemic failures. Having examined the CDC director's admonition that your health is in your hands, as a moral failure, we revisited this continuing failure in March, just 2 months ago. Considering the enduring individualism in US COVID-19 policy, and asking today, where is the public in American public health? This title harkens back to Alan Rosenfield and Deborah Main's 1985 article, Where is the M in MCH? Trying to reflect on those we are leaving behind and asking, who are we abandoning today? The federal government, by putting individual vaccination as central, if possibly our only path to mitigating the pandemic, that this US response has undermined and overlooked systemic inequalities in vaccination, while ignoring the plight of those ineligible for vaccination and those who remain at risk after vaccination. We have abandoned the most vulnerable, and a uniquely American framing of individual liberty has politicized the pandemic response in ways that have deepened divisions in our country and neglected fundamental rights. And so US policy continues to reframe the pandemic largely as a matter of individual responsibility to the detriment of public health. And I hope that our conversation today can both frame the political determinants and ethical implications of this shift away from collective action in facing a collective threat. And as we look ahead, can provide a path for us to prioritize again our public responsibility for public health. In moderating this conversation, I look forward to speaking with my co-authors, beginning with Cecília Tomori, who's an associate professor and director of global public health and community health at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, with a joint appointment at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Her work investigates the structural and sociocultural drivers that shape health, illness, and health inequities. Dr. Tomori is an internationally recognized expert on breastfeeding, infant sleep, and maternal and child health. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, she has supported numerous organizations focused on maternal and child health, has advocated for integrated and equitable pandemic policies, and examined how science and health policy are influenced by financial and political interests. We'll hear from Aziza Ahmed, a professor at law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. Her scholarship examines the intersection of law, politics, and science in the fields of constitutional law, criminal law, health law, family law, and international human rights law. Dr. Ahmed's work advances multiple scholarly conversations across disciplines, including those related to law and social movements, race in the law, and feminist legal theory. Thirdly, we'll hear from Dabney Evans, an associate professor of global health in the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. Her research is focused on gender, health, and human rights, developing projects on intimate partner violence during the COVID-19 pandemic, the commercial sexual exploitation of children, and femicide and perpetration. Dr. Evans is a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for the Lancet Commission on Gender-Based Violence and the Maltreatment of Young People. And finally, we'll hear from Aparna Nair, an assistant professor of history of science in the Department of History, Technology, and Medicine at the University of Oklahoma. Her research focuses on disability studies, colonial medicine, and the histories of public health, with a specific focus on quarantine and vaccination. Dr. Nair's recent interests examine the ways in which we represent disability and difference in popular culture. And in the pandemic, she's examined the disproportionate, if neglected, impact of the pandemic on disabled populations. In speaking to CFAR and drawing from the AIDS response, I hope to begin by focusing on the politicization of that AIDS response, looking at how the past is shaping our present struggles. Aziza, let me begin with you and ask about the AIDS response, which made it clear in so many ways that public health is political. And yet we see public health actors in the COVID response claiming once again that public health is not political. What have we learned? What have we failed to learn from the AIDS response in our current pandemic?
Thank you so much, Ben. Let me just also start by saying thank you to Carol and Wendy. And it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with my co-authors, and it's intimidating to present to this group. I see so many people that I read and cite to regularly. Yeah, I want to dive into this question that you've started us out with, Ben, which is an important one. And I think especially relevant for this group, who I imagine, like many of us, have been watching things play out and noting all the similarities with the past and our own work on AIDS. I thought I would divide or sort of start our conversation off by highlighting three dynamics, I think, which made and shaped AIDS as a sort of, and put it in sort of political context, and shaped that kind of outcomes we saw when it came to responding to the epidemic. The first is really structural, and that is, the fact that the AIDS epidemic came up during the Reagan administration, when the welfare state and, well, we never really had a welfare state, but when welfare and disability were under attack by the Reagan administration. And this was, of course, a neoliberal moment. Neoliberalism was gaining ground. People date it back to different periods. We could start at least with Nixon, but of course, much further back than that when we think about American politics. And, it was a moment like this in which science itself was mobilized to actually get people off of welfare and disability. And here I'm thinking about the amazing work by Keith Whaley, who's a historian of science, who has written about how the Reagan administration specifically turned to the objectivity of science to essentially get people off of disability, saying you need a doctor's note in order to get disability. All of that part of the broader project to essentially get people off of any sort of state or welfare support. I think today, and this would be the first dynamic, we see this. This is the legacy we are dealing with in the COVID crisis. People who are dealing with long COVID don't know where to go. Disability and access to disability remains limited. Our public health infrastructure has been lacking from the beginning, and due to this sort of broad attack on public health ever since but of course, ever since the 1980s, not only in the United States, but around the world, with structural adjustment programs put into place by the World Bank and IMF. The second dynamic I think that we see the legacy of between AIDS and COVID is the sort of targeting of particular people and the way populations, subpopulations have mattered. In the AIDS crisis, of course, we saw that gay men were both targeted and ignored in the response, but other people were also ignored too, injecting people who use drugs, sex workers, people in the global South. And here I think Kathy Cohen's book on the boundaries of Blackness, on the politics of AIDS in the Black community, is so important, because she really writes about how the Centers for Disease Control even then became a signaling institution, telling us who mattered, who to pay attention to, how we should pay attention to them. We see the legacy of this in COVID too. At the start of the pandemic, which feels so much longer ago than it is, the CDC wasn't collecting data, it wasn't publishing data, it wasn't, we were left to the journalists to collect data for us. Data for Black Lives was demanding that race be a part of the story, and the disaggregation of data. We are also in the legacy of the fact that the CDC was identified as a political agency. Women's rights groups, I write about this in my work, women's rights groups arrived at the CDC to say the CDC is killing us by not identifying us as a risk group as well. And we're left today in the legacy of an institution that never properly grappled with itself as situated politically. Other scientific agencies in the United States have done so, like the Environmental Protection Agency and like the Food and Drug Administration, not perfectly, but they've begun that process. They have built politics into their process, and the CDC has remained very resistant to that. And the third thing I would say is that we've still neglected to sort of speak publicly and openly. And I think this comes from the dynamic that Ben was really pointing out, that sometimes we see public health as sort of isolated from politics, that science and research and what the questions we ask are actually shaped by legal regulations and the regulatory infrastructure. So what we know about AIDS, what we know about AIDS risk groups, what we know about COVID is part of a longer story about what gets funded, who gets funded, who's lobbying the NIH, which groups are included in the NIH. Steve Epstein's work, he's a sociologist of medicine, has been very important here, for example, but it's important to recognize that what we know is constructed often by the legal infrastructure that's in place for funding research and making that research possible. So I'll stop there, but thank you, Ben.
And then I'll just piggyback and jump on and try and amplify a little bit some of what Aziza said, coming from my positionality at Emory University, which is located in Atlanta, so literally steps away from CDC, and highlighting a little bit more in terms of what she was speaking of in terms of the politicization, the increasing politicization of CDC and the ways in which CDC has been gradually roped in somewhat unwillingly and also shielded historically. And so I would really take us back even prior to the Reagan administration, although I agree with everything that Aziza said about that, but really thinking about the 1976 swine flu outbreak and the way in which during that time CDC initiated a mass vaccination program, very different from the childhood vaccine programs, which had been extremely successful up until that point. But unfortunately, that vaccination program was seen as a monumental failure, as many will know, because of a slightly increased risk for Guillain-Barré syndrome. And so the mass vaccination efforts were halted after about 25% of the US population received that vaccine. And that was really what some would argue as the beginnings of vaccine hesitancy, and also the beginnings of the degradation of trust in CDC as an institution. After that time, between 1977 and 1983, the CDC was directed by one of the greatest public health leaders of our time, Bill Foege, who many will know was the architect of the smallpox eradication program. And most notably, he served under both Presidents Carter and Reagan. And so this was really a time when CDC was sort of shielded from politics. It was seen as a place where science was taking place, and that was the priority. And also had this sort of geographic advantage of sorts in being situated outside of DC. And so sort of in a bubble of its own, away from politics, and largely depoliticized and shielded in some ways. But that really changed in 9/11. When after 9/11, when following the anthrax attacks that year, President Bush began focusing increasingly on bioterrorism, which is what really unwillingly immersed CDC in political processes and structures and highly sensitive political issues. And ever since that time, what we've seen, where in prior eras, CDC directors would serve under presidents of any party, CDC directors since that time have changed over with each change in presidential leadership. And alongside that, as Aziza mentioned, we've seen defunding of public health infrastructure from the federal level on down to the local level. And increasingly, and as relevant, bringing back in again, as we think about infectious disease and pandemics, increasing rises in vaccine hesitancies, for measles, some of the vaccines that were traditionally accepted have had this increasing vaccine hesitancy. And, the degradation of US buy-in to CDC, I've found myself personally on both sides of this equation, in that I don't work at CDC. And I think that I have a very strong responsibility to criticize CDC when they get it wrong, but also to advocate for CDC when they get it right. Because there are many wonderful scientists that work within CDC. And, during the Trump administration, for example, they were literally muzzled and banned from using certain words that included the words, diversity, entitlement, vulnerable, transgender, evidence-based, and science-based. But at the same time, some of the decisions and some of the practices, and I see some things that have been highlighted in the chat, as well as obviously the impetus for our own work, the your health is in your hands approach, are things for which we as scholars must be very critical of CDC at the same time as we want to support scientific inquiry and the use of that science for policymaking.
Can I step in, Ben? Sure.
Yes, please.
I think Aziza raised so many really interesting points, and as a disability studies scholar and as a historian of vaccination, I have, one of the things I want to underscore is the longer history of the use of biomedicine and of science to police who gets to claim disabled status, much longer than I think than the 20th century. You can go back to the Civil War, for instance, and how physicians were used by the state and how physicians themselves use this to augment their authority. I think as a historian of medicine, one of the things that has been extraordinarily frustrating is the sense during the pandemic that public health and medicine are not just apolitical endeavors, which is often repeated, but also that people who work in public health and biomedicine are inherently altruistic and incapable of being affected by the social, cultural, and historical context. And I think that's a very dangerous idea. And it's useful to look to the past to deconstruct some of our idealism, I think, about public health. The other comment I also wanted to make was that vaccine hesitancy in the US, at least, it dates back to the late 18th century with the beginning of inoculation, when smallpox inoculation was introduced, and people literally firebombed Cotton Mather's house in Boston to object to the introduction of inoculation. But yeah, those were my points. I'm not sure if I'm particularly coherent. I haven't had my coffee yet this morning.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us across multiple time zones at various hours of the day and amidst a very challenging time. As we focus on the history and the ways in which this is a recurring theme in American public health, a tension that has long existed, we reflect on this tension between individualism and collective action that really spurred and catalyzed this collaboration, and specifically focusing on government efforts to shift the COVID-19 response from collective responsibility for public health to individual responsibility for these health outcomes. We began and brought together this collaboration with the CDC director's admonition that your health is in your hands. And Cecília, you are responsible for starting this conversation among us and really leading that initial effort. And so I'm hoping that you can speak about a little bit about how this shift toward individualistic health responses has undermined the moral foundations of public health.
I think, and thanks for that question, man. I think this is one of those issues where, there's a sort of an urgency, a moral urgency that I think we all felt in the group, and we were speaking about those issues separately. And we reached out to each other, multiple of us across these networks, to try to form a different kind of conversation around these issues, because we didn't see enough attention to those moral foundations. And I think it's important to orient our conversations towards that, recognizing, as Ben started the conversation, that health and public health both are inherently political, something that can be challenging to work with and distinguish from sort of efforts to hijack it for particular political purposes. So that distinction between recognizing the structural nature of what we're doing and then the particular uses to which particular concepts are put, I think can be difficult, in conversations. And, as an anthropologist, I think, and someone who studied, both individualism, also morality and American culture, among other things, and with some background in, public health and infectious disease, I've been thinking a lot about what the implications of this shift are and where do they really come from. I think that there are multiple themes that I just wanted to touch upon. One is sort of the deeper history of individualism as a cultural ideology, which I have studied in particular in relation to parenting, actually, which is one of the sites at which those ideologies get reproduced. Because reproduction is, of course, not just about the physiological parts of reproduction, but about social reproduction. And so that was sort of my anthropological training. And so I read a lot about the origins of these ideologies. And of course, they come from Europe. And they took off in particular cultural groups, and they have been contested ever since. So the idea that individualism is some sort of overwhelming value that everybody shares in the United States, I think is a mistaken one to begin with. I think you can have ideologies that become dominant and against which we kind of keep articulating other kinds of narratives, but it is not the only cultural ideology out there. It has always been contested and it has never been shared across all cultural groups. So I think we can fall into these kinds of analytical traps and kind of just write this whole thing off as, you know, everybody just believes in these things and this is how it is. But in fact, those are also about power relations and who gets to define particular ideologies as the main ones and what voices are being left out. So I wanted to talk about that piece, so sort of the deeper history. And then I wanted to talk about this other piece, which is about how individualism as a concept has been deployed. And that's related to some of the points that Aziza, Dabney, and Aparna all brought up. But there were historical shifts in how ideologies of individualism have been used. And they are really important to recognize because and distinguish from, you know, these sort of the cultural force of some of these ideologies that we may be familiar with from other areas of our life. So there is this sort of moral piece to individualism that's really important here, and that can be put to political uses. One of the key arenas in the history of public health has been the deployment of this concept by corporations in particular, and politicians, and the two are of course intimately related. But if you are familiar with other kinds of public health issues like tobacco, like environmental regulation, in my particular case, formula marketing, alcohol marketing, you name it, all of these sort of essentially corporate efforts to market particular things for profit. Fossil fuel industry is one of the key ones. All of these are, you know, they are around, you know, they really take off in the 80s because of deregulation, and the themes are hijacked for these particular corporate objectives. And you will see them in, you know, advertising materials, and you will also see them, of course, deployed by politicians to make particular arguments. And those narratives shape how we think about the world. So what individualism does there is it allows the shifting of responsibility from the collective, from the state, from governments, and from corporations to individuals. And that's where that moral piece comes in, because then you can also blame people for doing it. So that's what we're seeing, I think, in the COVID narrative, is that, you know, if you have COVID, then you must have done something wrong. You're morally culpable because your status as being infected inherently makes you morally subject to moral blame. And that is why I think it really, for me, it touched a nerve. You know, not only your health is in your hand, but the next narrative, which is the pandemic of the unvaccinated, which is absolutely about moral blame and that shifting of responsibility. And that, to me, you know, immediately triggered these other relationships to concepts of individualism that I have seen used and deployed far beyond, you know, the historical, cultural piece of it, but to particular political and corporate purposes. So I think that is the main theme that I have been thinking about. And I think it's a very acute threat because it's an extremely effective strategy. And unfortunately, very few people, I think, recognize how these narratives are being deployed in multiple different arenas. So many of us focus on one particular one of these, right? So, you know, you might be an expert in tobacco, or we might be an expert in HIV. We might be an expert, you know, I'm an expert in breastfeeding. You know, these are not necessarily areas that have conversations with one another. And so I think it's really important to start thinking across these domains and think about how these narratives are being shaped. Who are they being shaped by? And what might be some other underlying agendas, usually linked to financial interests, that then result in particular policy decisions?
So as we think about these policy decisions, we recognize government responsibility and the importance of government responsibility, but also in a globalizing world, the need to look beyond the state. And so the COVID-19 pandemic is a truly global threat, affecting every country and making clear how interconnected our world is. As a public policy scholar, we think about how global health governance through the United Nations is essential in responding globally to the infectious disease threats of a globalizing world, where no single country can truly wall itself off from disease. And yet the COVID-19 pandemic we've seen has really shaken the foundations of global health governance and our global health governance system through the World Health Organization. Because of these same failings of collective action, of health equity, of human rights, the same moral failing that you're discussing, Cecilia, the disproportionate focus on individualism in domestic policy. This is mirrored by the nationalism that we're seeing in foreign policy. We are looking to isolated actors who are failing to recognize how interconnected we all are and our responsibilities to each other. And so in abandoning the global community, I really worry that nationalism has undermined our international cooperation in facing this common moral threat. And without efforts to ensure increased equity for COVID-19 testing, vaccination, and therapeutics across nations, we are continuing to see new variants continuing to emerge and undermining individual country efforts. And so we need to add to this conversation around collective responsibility a lens of global solidarity so that we can achieve collective action across nations, to think about the ways in which we can advance public health in a truly pandemic response and create a more equal world that we've been seeking to create through the United Nations through the end of the Second World War. In focusing on this equity issue, I now want to turn to Aparna to really think about equity and marginalization. Aparna, in the pandemic response in the United States and throughout the world, we've systematically marginalized minority and disabled voices. We've neglected vulnerable populations. How have these inequities in many ways exposed the moral failure of our pandemic response?
So I have a little bit of a long answer, and I hope that's okay. Historians are verbose.
You have a lot to cover.
Yeah, I do. I'm also very angry. My perspectives on the pandemic come from two very different disciplinary and philosophical backgrounds. One as a historian of public health in the global South, and the other as a disability studies scholar. And I've been watching the pandemic unfold, and for disabled communities and for disability advocates across the world, COVID has revealed how untrustworthy public health can be as a discipline and as a profession, because and I'm speaking from the perspective of disabled communities who have experienced public health in often violent ways for many decades. Disability is conceptualized in public health through the medical model of disability, and rarely less so through the social model of disability. So in public health narratives, disability is biomedicalized and individualized, despite the population foundation of public health, I think. And I think these aspects have been, there have been dissenting voices within public health, and this is one space, obviously. But it's been really striking how really influential voices in public health and in medicine have driven a narrative that has marginalized not just disability as a category of analysis for the pandemic, but as a category of experience, and also marginalized disabled voices. People have been using the internet to form community and express themselves during the pandemic. And, and sadly, the majority of the people who get heard in major media outlets and seem to be making, a headway with the government, whether it was the Trump administration or the Biden administration, seem not to be from that community, which is one of the most affected. For me, I've been trying to think through this historically, and for me, I've been seeing, several stages of systemic marginalization and ableism, which intersects with racism and sexism and classism in really dangerous ways during a pandemic. And the first of these was when the pandemic first started, and this whole narrative of herd immunity through infection kind of percolated into public discourse. It came from people in public health, from schools of public health, physicians, and it was horrifying to witness. People not just misunderstanding the concept, but once it had reached the public, it just, it was like a virus in the wild. There was no way to pull it back. And even now you find people using the concept of herd immunity by infection to argue that there's no need for masks, there's no need for any further public health intervention. Let's just get back to normal. And, and these were pushed by people who had access to power. The Great Barrington Declaration, for instance, Carter Atlas, and for politicians who feared the economic costs of the pandemic over anything else, it was a very seductive idea. But for the millions of disabled people who were watching and listening, it was harrowing. It was, this discursive toying with herd immunity as a legitimate, desirable response to a global crisis that affects us all. Just, I still cannot quite articulate how that feels, because essentially what you're saying is, yes, the small percentage of people who die, that's acceptable. This is a deeply these ideas have roots in Malthusian, social Darwinian, and eugenicist ideas of disease as population quality control, fundamentally. So, I've lost my train of thought. In the post-vaccine age, beyond the herd, the 2020 herd immunity debacle, I think people have also, and this ties back towards everyone else has spoken of, and how the individual, this narrative of I've done my part as an individual, I've gotten vaccinated, and that's it. I don't have to do anything else. And I'm not blaming the public for this. I think there are very influential voices in business and in politics who are pushing this narrative, and who are who want people to get back to work and get back to normal as quickly as possible, irrespective of the costs. Second, and the third of my 4 points is, I think the CDC appears not to take disability particularly seriously, and I'm assuming this on several pieces of evidence, including the fact that Rochelle Walensky described the mask as the red letter of the pandemic, and there've been several moments when she also went on national television and said that said something that was truly unfortunate, that it's only going to, I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something about the vaccine having substantially limited mortality rates for able-bodied people, it was only going to affect immunocompromised people. So the CDC represents public health. Disabled people are a part of that public. They're one of the most vulnerable groups within that, and it's a very heterogeneous, diverse population. So it's an extraordinary statement to make. I think it was a misstep. I'm trying to read it very charitably, but I think it is telling of where disabled people's, vulnerabilities and disability as a part of inequity stand in the pandemic response. I'm going to stop now. I have more, but I'm going to stop.
No, you have the arc of history to present to us. So thank you for bringing us along the way and thinking about how we keep making the same moral failings over and over again, with powerful voices from government, from corporations, even from the public health enterprise, at times prioritizing the individual and neglecting the public's health. This is something that goes back to the AIDS response that we began with and far before. The question now is, how do we change? How do we push a new narrative for public health that reflects collective responsibility, that ensures health equity, that realizes human rights? And so, Dabney, in turning to you for my last question before the breakout session, I'm hoping that we can discuss what a public health response to this public health threat would look like. Public health has long focused on the ways in which individuals are embedded in their societies, and yet this hope of public health was not realized. It has not been realized in the past, and it is not realized today in this pandemic response. How can we regain the social movements? How can we regain the moral foundations of public health in this challenging time? Dabney?
Well, it's not a small question, and I think it's something that every one of us can explore within the breakout sessions and hopefully beyond. But I'll try and provide maybe a couple of points of consideration. And so, coming from a public health lens, we love to talk about the socio-ecological model. And as has been highlighted throughout this panel, the focus and the very, very strong narratives that we are up against have been focused on the individual level to the exclusion of all of those other levels of consideration. And so in addition to the things that, and we called on some very specific things in our papers in terms of social policies and practices that were, specifically in response to this pandemic. But I think that the most focused, as all of us will be aware, has been on the individual level behavior change, right? That is testing, vaccination, masking up. All of these things are individual behaviors. And I know that this is a group of folks that work in social and behavioral change. And so I also know that you all know how difficult it is to change individual behaviors. And so as challenging and as strong as those individual narratives have been across levels of society and from political actors, business and otherwise, I think that our imperative as public health folks is to really begin and consistently bring into the conversation all of the other levels of the socio-ecological model. And so where are the questions about the interpersonal relationships that are happening between healthcare providers and individuals, that are happening between family members, right? I remember going on my first vacation after the pandemic had been going on for a while, after about a year, and with extended family, and being very clear about my boundaries about, I'm going to stay in my condo and we can meet on the beach. right? And we're not going to be, I had very clear, strong boundaries around those things. But where are those interpersonal relationships and recognizing the power dynamics that come in there? And then also thinking about the community level, and of course, importantly, the institutional and the structural level, which is the piece of the conversation that has been notably absent, particularly as we think about public health response and really the government and state response. So I think that that's one way for us to reframe the conversation, is that this is not only about individual action, there's more to it than that. And it's also not an either or, it is an and also, right? So it's not individualism versus collectivism, it is all of the above and everything in between. I think the other things that we have to think about, coming more from a health and human rights perspective, and building upon what Aparna said about concerns about vulnerable populations, people living with disability, the many people under age 5, the children under age 5 who are still not yet eligible for vaccination, as well as those under 12 who aren't eligible for boosters, which we know are so important, especially against protection against variants, is that we have to recenter in public health the most vulnerable among us. It is not about utilitarianism. It is about those most vulnerable and what they need are their needs are, and if their needs are met, all of our needs will surely be met. And so we have to think about it in that way. And there I would bring in as well what we call the AAAQ framework from the Right to Health, thinking about the availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality of healthcare goods and services. And there's a whole lot of writing on this. We can go into the devil in the details in it, but thinking about geographic accessibility, information accessibility, financial accessibility, and all of the social policies and programs that have been alluded to, right, in these conversations. Here we are 2 years into the pandemic, and when my child has I live in Georgia, where we now have a ban on masks. So when there is a case in his school classroom, the school's choice is to either send all children home because they have been exposed to a case of COVID, which infuriates many parents because they don't have childcare because school is childcare, or otherwise allow children to remain in school and not be able to require them to mask, even though they have knowingly been exposed. That's just one example of how we have set ourselves up for continued failure time after time by not having policies which are supportive of all of us in society, right? And so that, and there are many, many other examples that I can think of. But these are just a couple of ways in which we can bring in our public health theory into our policy and practice. And we as scholars and advocates need to be uplifting not only our science, but also these kinds of approaches into how we continue to grapple with COVID moving forward and other pandemics.
So I'm going to very briefly just leave us with some of these thoughts, because I think Dabney has eloquently articulated what we need to be doing. And we continue to push towards a different kinds of response. And I think we still have a moral obligation to work towards something better. I think every day we have opportunities of implementing the and or parts that Dabney was talking about, and to really think about what our moral center is, that we're working towards equity, that we're leading from the principles of human rights, and that we really can at least attempt to advocate for layered collective approaches that we know work because we have plenty of evidence, and not to be sort of swayed by the larger narratives that are being hijacked, unfortunately, for other kinds of political practices. We have plenty of ways to engage with these issues from whatever disciplinary backgrounds we may be coming from. So I will leave us with this, and then I know not all of us are able to be here for the breakout session, so we also wanted to thank Dabney in particular for joining us, and of course Aziza, who had to depart a little bit earlier, as we're all dealing with various obligations and the pandemic at the same time as we're here to be with you. So I am going to thank Dabney and let her go, because I believe you have to leave. So thank you so much, because it was such a pleasure to be together. We always enjoy being together, which is rare for us. We get to chat more than see each other live. So we will then move on to our next portion. So I will pass it over to the organizers.
Perfect.